That's a loaded question, Judge. I think we have to say that there was no negotiation because ultimately we had the Iranians that showed up with a contingent of almost 70 people armed with all sorts of data, information, analyses because they fully expected a negotiation to occur. Instead, what they got was a team from the United States that presented Mr. Netanyahu's demands to them. And they can't accept those demands. And I think that's being made pretty clear. And while there was some discussion about the enriched uranium, ultimately the outcome was simply no, we cannot conform to your expectations. And our expectations are Mr. Netanyahu's expectations. So frankly, I think the answer is pretty clear. We negotiated on behalf of Israel.
McGregor's blunt phrase, "we negotiated on behalf of Israel," is devastating because it uses the exact language of the judge's question without hedging. The vivid detail of the Iranians arriving prepared with a contingent of almost 70 people armed with all sorts of data, information, analyses because they fully expected a negotiation to occur stands in sharp contrast to the U.S. side, which simply presented Mr. Netanyahu's demands to them and they can't accept those demands. McGregor's repeated emphasis on Mr. Netanyahu's demands and "our expectations are Mr. Netanyahu's expectations" proves the meeting was pure theater, not diplomacy. The Colonel's conclusion, frankly, I think the answer is pretty clear, delivers an unvarnished verdict that inverts American sovereignty in its own foreign policy, exposing how U.S. negotiators acted as proxies rather than representatives of American interests. Takeaway: when U.S. diplomats present another nation's demands as their own, American interests have been subordinated to foreign ones. What does it say about U.S. sovereignty when we negotiate on behalf of another country?
Well, I think Mr. Netanyahu regards this as an all or nothing proposition. In his estimation, and I think in the estimation of the people that surround him, this is Israel's best shot at removing what Israel considers to be its most serious threat, and more important, its most serious obstacle to their domination of the entire region. Now, why do they feel that way? Because they have essentially unconditional total control of U.S. military power in the region. I think the CENTCOM commander, who's now Admiral Cooper, his predecessor was Kurilla. These men have fallen all over themselves to ingratiate themselves with Mr. Netanyahu, understandably, since that's ultimately the man that is calling the shots in the region. So I think Mr. Netanyahu's view is either I make this work, I realize the greater Israel project, it becomes real as a result of destroying Iran, or we in Israel are going to have a tough time surviving in the region. And I think he's probably right, because you can't call all of your neighbors subhuman or criminals and then expect to get along with them when the war stops. And that's his position. So, yeah, I think he's in this to the bitter end, and he's going to do whatever he can to obstruct any sort of arrangement that brings this conflict to a close. Well, I think it was more likely a Freudian slip, because remember, he went on to elaborate and say, well, I hear from everyone in the government in Washington on a routine basis, practically every day. They all report. I think he's telling you the truth. And, you know, when he tells you the truth, you should pay attention, because we don't hear the truth that often from him. So on this particular occasion, I think he very definitely is telling you what's real.
The Colonel's use of Greater Israel Project and domination of the entire region directly quotes Netanyahu's worldview without softening it, framing the conflict as existential for Israel's regional ambitions. McGregor ties this to unconditional total control of U.S. military power in the region, and notes how senior U.S. commanders have fallen all over themselves to ingratiate themselves with Mr. Netanyahu, calling him the man that is calling the shots in the region. The Freudian slip analysis that Netanyahu said Vice President Vance is reporting to him as other administration officials do daily, and then elaborated, I hear from everyone in the government in Washington on a routine basis practically every day. They all report, is presented as rare truth-telling from a man who rarely tells the truth. This segment makes the influence relationship explicit and undeniable rather than conspiratorial, revealing a power dynamic where Israeli priorities dictate U.S. actions. Takeaway: Netanyahu sees the destruction of Iran as the key to realizing the Greater Israel Project. His Freudian slip confirms that senior U.S. officials routinely report to him. If this analysis is opening your eyes, hit subscribe and follow. Truth this direct is rare.
Well, Judge, I don't know that they didn't realize that. I've got to go back 20 years, but if I go back 20 years, I can identify lots of plans connected with potential operations against Iran. And all of those plans were written with an understanding that, first of all, if you were going to try and employ ground troops, you were probably on your way to the loony bin, because the various routes of entry and points of invasion and so forth were troubled with mountain passes and lots of choke points, about 300 different points in time and space with bridges and so forth, that you had to give up on the notion of going into the country very far unless your only objective was to occupy Khuzestan, which was ultimately what Saddam Hussein tried to do. Those are the oil fields. But otherwise, everything revolved around targeting and trying to induce the Iranian government to comply. But most of these plans were developed before there was the full realization of how profoundly warfare had changed. And I don't think a lot of people in the Pentagon or the Department of Defense and the planners at the top were completely aware of how lethal the connection would be between space-based surveillance and the persistence surveillance that results, and the instantaneous communication of targeting information to hundreds of different strike systems, manned and unmanned, all kinds of missiles, and the pinpoint accuracy with which they would be launched. I just don't think people realize that. They should have figured it out by watching what emerged in eastern Ukraine when General Surovikin established the initial defense, against which our forces, the NATO forces that had been trained by us in Ukraine, tried to attack and failed miserably, but they didn't do it. So I think, in fairness, that particular item was not fully appreciated. I think they still thought, well, we have bases in the region, bases in the Persian Gulf. We're close enough, we can amass enough firepower that we can enter and leave without too much interference. I don't think they understood the implications of the military development inside Iran. So you could say we grossly underestimated them, but I think we missed this paradigm shift in warfare.
McGregor uses precise military language. Choke points, mountain passes, about 300 different points in time and space with bridges and so forth, to explain why any ground invasion was always a loony bin idea, referencing Saddam Hussein's failed attempt to occupy Khuzestan for its oil fields. He admits the Pentagon missed how lethal the connection would be between space-based surveillance and the persistent surveillance that results, and the instantaneous communication of targeting information to hundreds of different strike systems, manned and unmanned. Citing the failed NATO offensives in eastern Ukraine under General Surovikin as the missed lesson, McGregor states the planners grossly underestimated them and missed this paradigm shift in warfare. The segment highlights the outdated belief that U.S. bases in the Persian Gulf would allow forces to enter and leave without too much interference, proving the planners clung to pre-modern assumptions despite 20 years of plans. Takeaway: the Pentagon's faith in air power and bases in the Persian Gulf blinded it to the new reality of persistent surveillance and precision strike systems that Iran now exploits in the Strait of Hormuz. How could the world's most expensive military miss a 21st century paradigm shift?
Well, this is true. And I'm not necessarily saying that about all of the senior officers that I met, because large numbers of them were very balanced people. I also happen to know that many of them were removed and replaced by others. And I think we have to understand that since the ground force option was off the table from the very beginning, at least insofar as invading Iran is concerned, that all of the strategic and operational planning from that point forward was done by the air power community. And by that, I mean Air Force officers and naval officers. Very little attention was paid to the use of ground forces anywhere, but potentially within the framework of the Persian Gulf. So I don't think it's entirely surprising, because the air power community takes it as an act of faith that if they're allowed to attack with aircraft and missiles long enough, they can win any war that you want them to fight. They really, truly believe that. And they'll point to anything, whether it was successful or not, and try to claim credit for having won the war surely with the use of air power. So I I don't think that's the issue. I think the larger issue is back to what you said. They didn't really understand what they were up against. That the enemy they thought they were going to fight turned out to be very different. And
Right.
that's essentially what happened to us, I would argue, in many places, including Vietnam. You know what? If you read the intelligence reports and the assessments of the Germans before we landed in Normandy, we depicted the German army as on its last legs. We expected to get much further, much faster than we did. And as a result, when we went to Okinawa, we used far more forces than we did at Normandy because we recognized that we'd underestimated it. So, you know, I wish I could give you a better answer, but I think we just miscalculated and underestimated. I think he'd probably say that's not for discussion, and he might not even acknowledge that they have any. That's been the policy now for years and years and years. But we know they've got at least 300 weapons.
When I asked Joe Kent yesterday, he laughed and he said, everybody in the national security part of the federal government of the United States of America can tell you how many nuclear warheads the Israelis have. But we're not allowed to say it in public, Judge.
Yeah. Well, look, this is a unique set of circumstances. We're dealing with a state that has leverage over everybody in Washington as a result of having systematically invested in control of our government. And they now have large numbers of people all across our government who are absolutely loyal to Israel first. And by the way, they're by no means all Jewish. So I can't be surprised by any of this. You know, you're familiar with the legal record, and you know that in 1965 there was a Supreme Court case that found it in favor of dual citizenship.
Yeah.
And that, I think, was a catastrophe for us. I've always been a strong believer that if you are a dual citizen, you should not hold elected office or appointment in any federal position. That's just my attitude. I think you can only be loyal to one state at a time. Preaching to the choir, and many of us sort of shake our head in disbelief that we've gone along with this for as long as we have. Perhaps this event will change things, because right now the president has no easy way out of the position he's in right now. He's talked himself into a corner. He's made bold, rash statements reminiscent of people like Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War that make his retreat from these policy positions virtually impossible. And so what is he going to do? He can do one of two things, frankly. He can escalate. And I still think that's his inclination, because that's his nature. You know that. He's
Right.
Roy Cohn's loyal pupil. So I think he's predisposed to escalate. And I think we're waiting for additional forces to be in position before we do anything. And I suspect that by Saturday, those forces should be on station. So that's the first thing. Second thing is he can keep up this blockade, but the blockade is not perfect. Ships have slipped through, I'm told. It also is very expensive. There's no guarantee that it'll make any difference. Remember that when we blockaded Cuba, we called it a quarantine to avoid trouble with the legal language, but we used 180 surface vessels. The blockade actually reached all the way out into the North Atlantic. And we did this in effectively our home waters, which meant that we could fly from bases in the United States and we could sustain all the ships at sea very easily. We're not in that position over in the Indian Ocean or in the Mediterranean anymore. What are we going to stop? Are you going to put ships in the Caspian Sea? I don't think so. Can you stop rail lines and pipelines that Iran has access from operating? It's tough. It's not easy. I think at some point someone's going to wake up and say, we can't effectively blockade this place. And then the third consideration, I think this is more relevant now than ever, Judge. About 50% of the fertilizer in the world that is utilized by the global south comes out of the Persian Gulf. And right now in India, for instance, the cost of fertilizer has more than doubled. Now, there are two things that keep our civilization operating. One is cheap energy. We're losing that very, very rapidly. Our prices here at home are going to rise. They're rising all over the world. It's really catastrophic in places like Europe. It's very hard on our friends in Japan and Korea, all of Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia. So cheap energy is no longer cheap. That's disastrous for us. The second thing you get with cheap energy is cheap credit. That is drying up. And when you look at the world today and the countries that are in a position to provide cheap credit, there's only one, and that's China. And China is very rapidly becoming the safe haven for cash from all over the world, not the United States, not anymore. And we also forget that when we freeze billions of dollars that belong to the Russians, billions that belong to Iran, billions that belong to anybody, we send a terrible signal to the rest of the world that if you put your money within our reach, if you use our system, our SWIFT system and so forth, we can do with your cash, with your assets, anything we want whenever we do it.
Right.
China is not going to do that. It's made it very clear. So what we've done with this crisis thus far is not simply made China that much more attractive as a reliable business partner for the world. We've also made BRICS an extremely attractive organization to join and get out from under us. So logic dictates, dump the blockade, release the funds, and announce to the world that on humanitarian grounds, you, President Donald Trump, are ending this conflict because it's hurting the world. And you know that, and you don't want to hurt the world. You want complete freedom of navigation for everyone. And so we're ending this blockade and we are disengaging, and we will find other ways to resolve our dispute with Iran. But, Judge, we have a party that's involved.
Israel.
That is Israel. And Israel is not going to allow that.
Every claim is anchored in specific words from the guests. The air power community takes it as an act of faith that aircraft and missiles can win any war, the acknowledgement of Israel's at least 300 weapons that everybody in the national security part can tell you, but we're not allowed to say it in public, and the stark reality of officials absolutely loyal to Israel first, enabled by the 1965 Supreme Court decision on dual citizenship. McGregor's economic warnings are equally precise. About 50% of the fertilizer in the world, utilized by the global south cost of fertilizer has more than doubled in India, the loss of cheap energy and cheap credit, and how freezing assets has made China the safe haven while pushing nations toward BRICS. The philosophical close. Israel is a messianic eschatological interested in the end of times, apartheid nation. The United States is the opposite. It is secular. It believes in the value of every human being, and it embraces the Enlightenment. Highlights the profound ideological mismatch with McGregor's exit strategy, dump the blockade on humanitarian grounds. Blocked because Israel is not going to allow that. Takeaway. U.S. policy is trapped by Israeli leverage, dual citizen influence, and outdated military doctrine, while the economic pain is pushing the world toward China and BRICS, proving that endless war harms America more than any enemy. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and follow, because the conversation America needs is happening right here. What if the real threat to American freedom is not abroad, but the influence shaping our own government?